Okay, so I think that we're live, or at least I think that we're recording. We're live right now, but we're going to use a video because we've transitioned to a new platform. So welcome to the online Micro JC book club discussion. And so today we're going to be talking about the book Pathfinders, Golden Age of Arabic Science by Jim Al-Khalili. And I want to, normally right now I would start with introductions. I'm Laura Williams. I'm kind of hosting this. But Nicole Suktio needs to skip out for a meeting, and she posted some great comments to Twitter, but I just want to give her a chance to give her general thoughts on this. So I'm going to actually just flip it right to Nicole. So Nicole, do you want to, before you have to take off, give us your perspective on the book?
Absolutely. So as Laura mentioned, I'm Nicole Suktio. I'm a scientist at Concentric Agriculture Incorporated in Montreal, and I tweet as Old Dusty. So if you see the Clippy icon associated with Laura's tweets, particularly for the event today, that's me, and those are my comments about the book. So briefly, just for those of you who kind of want a more audio-visual way of interacting with the content of this book, on YouTube, and I suppose in a BBC archive, there is a 3-part series that's actually narrated and hosted by Jim Al-Khalili called Science and Islam, where he touches on a lot of the major figures and intellectuals in this book. And you can very much tell that he's a physicist and a math lover at heart, because with that video series, he definitely gets into things like the base 10 notation and the decimal point. So that is one obvious nod that we've noticed. The book does pay homage to al-Khwarizmi, the founder and sort of originator of algebraic manipulation of numbers and algorithms. But I think the things that I really took away from this book, in a less focused sense, is what happens when you have a society or a caliphate that's really using in a very pragmatic, political, but also probably deeper than that, a passionate hunger for developing a society that acquires knowledge and sort of incentivizing to get the collection of, material from other cultures that represents intellectual breadth of the time. So the translation movement chapter for me was a really big one, because I had no idea about that whole historical context. To me, and it's referenced in my comments, it kind of seems like viscerally, if you're a translator, you probably became a polymath. And if you were interacting with the versions of material as they were coming in, probably with a lot of chaos with respect to what people could get their hands on, you were engaging as a polymath because you were probably hungry for whatever was available in libraries or in the House of Wisdom. So this idea of desire to acquire knowledge, desire to acquire a certain extent of intercultural competency in the rule of al-Mamun makes me really think about the advantages of sort of peeking in on other disciplines, not just for literacy, but for these other insights. And also just the ideas about a translator's job, which is to literally translate, which means facilitating communication, but it also means that there has to be some content knowledge literacy to make sure that the translation is accurate. So compared to the way we do deep learning in education, I can't even imagine the deeper deepness that a translator has to go to engage with this material. And the one thing I also really loved about this book is Al-Khalili's attempts at creating chapters dedicated to different scholars of the time, like al-Khwarizmi and Avicenna, which is sort of the Latinized version of the name of that other individual, and very much emphasizing that for some of the empiricists, so the scientists and the chemists, their commitment to documentation and methodology. There were a lot of hardcore practitioners of what we understand as elements of the scientific method. And these scholars of Arabic science do deserve their credit, as presented by Al-Khalili, for being able to be that sort of methodologically holistic and sort of committed to that line of inquiry. So that's kind of my general comments about that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. I know you have to run to a meeting, so I don't want to keep you. So you should feel free to pop out whenever you need to.
Yeah, I'm thinking at this 10-minute mark before is a good time for me to go just to get
Yes,
myself sorted out. So thank you for giving
absolutely.
me space for that.
Absolutely.
And have a
Yeah,
great,
thank you for popping in. It was good to see you.
all right, take care, everyone.
See ya. Okay, so Nicole is headed off to her meeting. Hopefully that goes well. And she did post a few things to Twitter that which I'll try to kind of reiterate some of what she said when it kind of comes in. So what we could do now is I think we can hopefully introduce ourselves now that we have this opportunity to do that. So that was normally what we would do at the beginning, but I wanted to make sure Nicole had a chance to give her thoughts. So my name is Laura Williams. I'm an assistant professor at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island. I am a microbiologist, and so the math, physics, astronomy is certainly a bit more distant. It's kind of, I'm pulling back from college. In fact, I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, but he has a lot in this book about trigonometry. And I was kind of like straining my brain. I was like, oh man, I remember trig, sort of. So it was kind of good reminders of things that we have learned, or at least I have learned, and then had forgotten a bit about. So I'm looking forward to talking about it for that reason. Sangeeta, would you like to introduce yourself? Oh, I think you're muted at the moment. There we go.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Sangeeta. I work at Imperial College London, and I'm a mathematical epidemiologist. So mathematics is very close to my heart, and I did enjoy reading this book. And I didn't finish it. I'm only up to page 73, so I'll be mute for most of this call. But I look forward to listening to everyone else's thoughts.
And then I think we've got Lucy by phone.
Hello.
Excellent.
Hi, I'm Lucy McCulley. I'm also a microbiologist. So again, the math was sometimes a little bit of a reach, but it was a really great book, and I can't wait to talk about it.
Excellent. And so Lucy is joining us by phone currently, but it's possible that she will get in front of a computer and then switch over to computer. So Lucy, at any time, if you need any technical support on that, definitely feel free to let me know. We can help you out.
Will do. Thank you.
Okay. So I want to give some context for the overall thesis of this book, which, boy, this was actually my suggestion, this book, because I don't know if it was, this book was written, I think he says he wrote it in 2009, and then I believe it was published in 2010. Yep, 2010. And it's been on my radar for a really long time, and I just never had a good excuse to read it. And so when we were choosing books or proposing books for this particular book club, I put this one on the list because I thought, if nothing else, I'll maybe get a chance to read it. And I was really pleased to see that other people had voted for it as well. And part of my purpose in proposing this book is because I read the back of it and I thought, I don't know anything about any of this. I don't know any of these names. I don't know any of these people. And he mentions in this book, it's, the back cover tells you, this covers about 700 years of history. So his thesis in this book is that the Islamic world and Islamic science made a bridge from the Greek philosophers to the European Renaissance. So when we learn, or at least in the United States, when we learn in history classes that there was the Dark Ages, he's arguing, no, the Dark Ages for Europe was the golden age of Islamic science and Arabic science. And I read this and thought, I am a little upset that this is the first I'm hearing about all of these people. I've gone through all my schooling that I'm required to do. I've gone through college, I've gone through graduate school, and I had absolutely no idea. In any of these people. I did not know any of these people. And so I was just kind of curious for you two, were you familiar with any of these names beforehand? Was any of this something that you'd run across?
Well, algebra is very common. Like everybody, anytime you talk about algorithms or algebra, people will tell you that. So that was the one name that I was familiar with. But other than that, they were all new to me.
Lucy, did you know any of these folks ahead of time?
I did not. I also felt very upset that I hadn't really heard of any of these people beforehand.
Yeah, and I think there's kind of a couple of interesting things going on, and I'm curious if you guys have thoughts about this, because there are a couple of places in the book where, let me put it this way, the overall goal of this book is very clearly to do exactly what it did for the three of us, and I think Nicole would agree too, which is to bring to our attention this kind of unrecognized and somewhat neglected period of history in this particular region. And he definitely does that incredibly well. And he shows the threads that certain fields such as philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, chemistry, he shows the threads between the Greeks and then these philosophers and scientists and scholars that he's talking about in his book, and then into the European Renaissance, where the names become the names that I'm much more familiar with. But then it's interesting too, because there's parts where I feel like he's trying to make arguments for kind of anointing one person as being like the father of this field or the father of that field. And then there's parts in the book where he kind of undercuts that approach and says, well, it's not really, you can't really make somebody the father of any field because it's always people who are building on other things. And so it was interesting to me because I almost felt like he was at cross purposes at certain points, like trying to make an argument for somebody being kind of the prime ancestor of a particular field, and kind of at the same time saying like, no, that's not what's going on at all. We've really just, it's all builds. Did either of you pick up on that too?
Not really. I didn't feel that, but I did feel, I mean, it's tangentially related to what you're saying, but I did feel that he was very balanced in his approach. So usually people, when they write a book like this, they would get carried away. And I have read a lot of books where people will say, okay, well, so if they want to write about, say, let's say Mongolian period, they'll say everything good that happens ever is because of Mongols, or, you know, so he was very balanced in that he didn't say anything that came out of that period was because of this region and these scientists. He was quite balanced, but I didn't pick up, maybe because I didn't read the whole book, I didn't pick up on what you were saying.
Lucy, did you have any? I see you. We got you by video now.
Yeah, I think I did pick up on that a little bit, but I think that was maybe him trying to strike a balance between those two things, of trying to be like, yes, we could call this person like the father of this because they, you know, technically did this particular thing or this particular thing beforehand. But then he also does later emphasize, you know, even things like Einstein or something was like all building on stuff that had already existed. And so I did have, you know, some parts where I was like, oh, well, you're making this person sound like they're the best thing ever. But I think he does later sort of maybe like moderate himself a little bit by being like, but it's like a group effort.
Yeah. And I feel like the main reason I noticed it was not because I almost felt like he didn't need to try to make an argument that somebody was the father of something. There were times in the book where I was like, listen, man, I'm already really super impressed. Like, you don't need to try to like I'm already really amazed at all of these. I'm learning a lot already. I'm being introduced to people that I didn't know about, and you're making the connections. That is one thing he did very well, I think, was make it very clear what the contributions of not only individual people, but scholars that were working contemporaneously and having correspondences with each other, and then groups. I mean, he made those arguments very clear that what they were doing was not only carrying on the scholarly tradition of the Greeks, but also doing their own original scientific enterprise and investigation and philosophy and advancing things, so that, you know, what we're more familiar with in terms of the Enlightenment and so forth, that picks up on those threads. So I think the main reason I noticed it is because I just found passages where there was like, this person is the father of this. I'm like, you don't need to try to bend yourself backwards to try to convince me of that. I'm already very impressed. But so I'm curious. So Sangeeta, you said you got through kind of the beginnings of the book.
Yeah.
And one of the things that gets addressed in the beginning of the book is kind of situating this period of scholarship in its origins, which Jim Al-Khalili argues is a period of time in, I want to say, like late 8th century, early 9th century Baghdad, in the time of a caliph called Al-Mamun. And he talks a little bit about the translation movement and the importance of that. So that's the idea that one of the first major efforts of scholarship in that area at that time was to translate the works of Greek philosophers to Arabic so that they could be understood by people working in that time. And he talks a bit about why this is important. I don't know if there's anything in particular that jumped out at each of you about his discussion of the translation movement.
I was a little bit familiar with this idea of Greek text being translated into Arabic. And I just love that image of scholars translating these texts. And like Nicole said, you have to have a certain level of content literacy with the subject matter, but and translation, I mean, just like my thoughts are a little bit all over the place, but I think like translation, people take it, if you introduce yourself as a translator, it would probably be taken very lightly, but I think translation is so challenging and it brings so much. And one of the things that I really liked about his discussion was the way that he portrayed this idea that there was not one single translation, but there were multiple translations, and each translation gained something from the previous translations. And then the scholars began to contribute stuff of their own, even as they were translating these things. So the way the knowledge kept on building on itself was a really beautiful idea to me. I really love that.
Yes, I agree. I think and your point about how they added things. So, you know, like it's almost like versions of a text. You know, you have the original, but then by the time you got to the second translation or the third translation, now they've started to add their own original thinking.
Yeah.
Which I can imagine also complicates things for historians if they're trying to figure out who to attribute particular knowledge or particular discoveries to. That can probably be complicated as well.
Yeah.
Lucy, did you have any?
Yeah, so I did like that they talk about how some of the early translations were translated like from Persian, and then they start like going into the original Greek, and they you know start saying like, oh, you know, this thing could have been translated like this other way. The thought too of like being well versed enough in a subject and in a language to translate something, like I'm bilingual and I couldn't do that from Spanish to English. Like I like absolutely not. But I love that chapter on the translation and the like he puts it all in, I think, a really cool context of like how all this like scholarship started building up. And he like talks about like you know, the different technologies and situational things that helped do this, like the paper mill was one of the things that he talked about, or how like being into astrology meant that they wanted to like because the Persians were still like, I think Zoroastrian is the term, and so how, you know, a little bit of the earlier translations was trying to be like a lot of astrology and stuff, but you know, you just get like all these things coming together, and then that's what the translation, and then that's like the springboard, right, from where they start making all of these discoveries, because it's, you know, they're like, look at all of this knowledge that we got from the past, and now there's a limit. And that's when they started adding like all of their annotations, or like, this is wrong. And it was just a very cool for him to like actually give us that context, I thought.
And I thought it was interesting how he makes a point that Al-Mamun in particular, but I think others of that time who were influencing this movement were kind of hungry for pretty much any texts that they could get their hands on. So they had not only access to the texts from the Greeks, but then also, Lucy, you've already mentioned, like Persian and Indian, and so they're pulling in whatever they can get. And at one point, he makes the point that, so let's say you've pulled in all these different texts on astronomy and you sit down to translate them. And what happened is they essentially, if I remember it right, they essentially realized that not all of the texts agreed. And so they're getting these texts from different sources, and they're going and they're looking at them like tables of you know, constellations and things like that, and things that people had calculated for coordinates and so forth. And they're looking at them and they're going, oh, wait a minute, like these don't all say the same thing. Oh, these could be wrong, you know? And I think that that's a real moment, because up to that point, you could probably, you know, if you were just kind of immersed in one particular school of thought from one particular area, you might fall into the habit of being like, well, you know, this is always right. This person, like Ptolemy's tables are always right. There's just, he's not wrong at all. He's never wrong. But if you've got access to scholarly work from lots of different places, you actually get an opportunity to kind of step back and go, oh, wait a minute, these don't all agree. I wonder why.
How we, like, what we do in the modern times, we do systematic reviews, is like a big mega systematic review of all the knowledge in the world.
And what they basically concluded is, we don't know that this is right, so let's go build a big astronomical observatory and do it again. Yeah. See what we can do.
He also makes the point of like they weren't sure how the units matched.
True.
Right? I forget what the Greek unit of measurement was called, but they were like, how does this translate into the Arabic mile? I don't remember.
Yeah.
but you know, like that was one of the things that they had to figure out, because you know you have to like get these measurements from these coordinates into this thing. So like, let's go out into the desert and, you know, walk 1,000 paces and figure that out. And to your point too, that they were hungry for knowledge. Wasn't there a passage, I think, where after Al-Mamun either vanquished somebody in combat or like expanded the borders further, and they were like, as tribute, they wanted like a bunch of books from their library.
It's like, give me books.
Yeah,
which you kind of think is a very unusual thing for like a triumphant ruler to be like, "What are your books?" Okay. Well, and I was just, as a follow-up to that, what I was going to say is that follows from that is so it's that takes. He talks about Al-Mamun as being very significant in this, and I can understand why, because let's say you'd put all this effort into having all these translations done, and then your scholars come back to you and they go, hey, guess what? As it turns out, all this stuff doesn't agree with each other about what it's supposed to be. So we don't actually know for sure what we were supposed to find out. And it takes a ruler to be like, really? Well, let's figure it out, rather than be like, I will kill all of you right now for not knowing the answer to this question, right? So, I mean, it took a very particular type of person to essentially accept that what they were learning from their translations required effort to then investigate on their own and support. And, you know, the people in charge, the caliphs had to say, yeah, we're going to give you money to build this giant astronomical observatory. Then we'll build a second one, and then we'll compare our measurements, and then we'll see if we're, you know, so that when I was reading that, I was thinking like, yes, state funding of science.
I was thinking exactly the same thing.
Definitely important.
Yeah, how much must like I have loved science to be like, here, have all the money.
Yeah, just you build this thing. That sounds like a great idea. Yeah, I would have liked to meet this person. I think he would have been very interesting. So that I thought was really, really significant. And kind of the questions that they decided they wanted to tackle. And there's a point that he makes about, particularly with astronomy, that it was tied very much to astrology in the beginning, but there was a certain point in these 700 years of scholarship within this region that it was separated, that astronomy was treated as an exact science apart from astrology, and it was still given priority. It was still, you know, they did things like try to calculate the circumference of the Earth. I mean, these are like big things they did. They're just like, and they were pretty close. And you know, Lucy, you already mentioned the people walking through the desert. And then later on, some couple of hundreds of years later, you get another guy who does it by measuring the height of a mountain and doing some trigonometry. And I love the little quote from him. He goes, "Here is a method to calculate the circumference of the Earth. It does not require walking through deserts."
I loved that quote.
Okay. All right. It's like, so you don't have to do all that stuff. But they do get into, so I want to kind of, so they move from the so he kind of sets the context with talking about the translation movement. And then his approach to the rest of the book, more or less, was kind of talking a little bit about individuals who kind of have emerged through history for, you know, because they deserve it, and also through chance, have kind of emerged through history as being particularly notable scholars. And I think that the one that he starts with is actually the Al-Jabir, the chemist. And this is where I was like, wow, he's doing a lot of chemistry. I don't know, Sangeeta, did you get to this part as well?
Yeah, I just barely finished that chapter, The Lonely Alchemist, yeah.
And then, so this is discussing a lot of, this is, I think, if I remember right, where he kind of introduces the idea of practice of the scientific method. So how many of these scholars were doing truly original science through experimentation? And he makes the argument that Jabir was, because he was doing different things having to do with trying to kind of, boy, I mean, there's a list that's like practical things: prevention of rusting, the use of manganese dioxide in glass making, and the tanning of leather. So different industrial processes, and just trying to kind of explore all of these things. I can go on, but does anybody have thoughts about this particular individual?
For the chapter, I don't know about the individual specifically. Well, for all the individuals, like, he does go into like how many other bits of scholarship they were experts in, and I'm just like, how do you have that much knowledge? You're basically a scholar in everything. But he talks about like all the names of different chemical things that come from Arabic. So I think it was stuff like alkaline and alcohol, benzoic and elixir, and I was like, wow, that's really cool. Like, I'll you know, it's not only that the scholarship came from there, but also that those words ended up following the techniques, you know, into the rest of the world. And was this the Alchemist where he was more doing like chemistry than alchemy?
If I remember right, yes. I think this is where he introduces the idea that you can distinguish them, that the term alchemist was historically used to really describe a chemist, and not necessarily somebody who is trying to like make gold out of random things around the house. I don't know.
It's amazing though, like all the different kinds of technologies, I guess he developed. So like, I think one of the things he talks about is like he makes colored glass, which is like, you know, the stuff they use to decorate mosques later on and that kind of thing, or the alembic, is that how it's pronounced, for distillation?
Ooh, yeah, I'm not good with that. So I'll go with that. That sounds good.
And so that's so cool. Like this person was just, you know, understood materials well enough to be like, if you do this thing, then you will get this other thing, and you can distill alcohol from it. And I don't even know how you make colored glass. So
yes.
Oh, soap was the other one he talked about.
Right, yeah, soap, making soap. Yes. I remember that.
Like on an industrial scale.
I see we've got Luke too. So Luke looks like Luke has just joined us. Yes?
Yes.
I see him, but I wasn't sure if he's successfully joined.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool.
Very good. So Luke, feel free to jump in whenever you like.
Okay.
How far did you get so I don't put you on the spot?
So I got to like, what's the page here? 216.
Oh, you did? Yeah, okay.
And so the part that I left off with is the scholars who kind of preceded Copernicus with having the sun as the center of the solar system.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So at the moment, we kind of, towards the beginning of the book, we've just talked a little bit about the origins of this particular movement of scholarship. I like this chapter, chapter 6. Chapter 6 is called Big Science. So I appreciate that he's made that. He doesn't ever explicitly, I think, say anything in the chapter about this concept of doing big science, but I like that he made that the chapter title, because he's like, yeah, this is not new. They've been doing big science projects for a while.
I loved that chapter, how they, like, he talks about, like, he actually organized these people, right, to do science together, because I feel like a lot of science and philosophy and things that you learn about in history, you almost always learn about a single person, and here that's the point, that it's a group of people walking through the desert, or, like, you know, building these big observatories and, like, doing all these things. And I really liked that sentiment, and actually being able to see it being, you know, talked about historically.
Yep. And so he discusses 3 ambitious projects that the House of Wisdom, which is this kind of center of scholarship and research, embarked upon. And we've talked about a couple of them. One is to build the observatories were used to kind of, as I understand it, kind of generate more accurate astronomical observations. And then calculate the circumference of the Earth, because you should do that. You should know. And then also, what I thought was awesome too is the third project that he features, at least, was that Al-Mamun said, okay, well, we should really get a better map of the world, which I think is always really interesting. You know, I was actually just on vacation, and we went to a maritime museum where they had a map, and I'm going to forget the name of the guy who did it, but it's really interesting to see these maps, because it tells you a lot about how people conceptualize the world, and it tells you a lot about what they did and didn't know. So this particular map, which is dating from much later than this book is covering, kind of North America was just like California was kind of like, maybe it's there, we don't know. So it's always, I find it always really kind of, I don't know, a little bit wonderful to think back on a time when people honestly did not know some parts of the world, like what was there. They kind of had a decent idea of regions around them. They had a decent idea that there might be some things here or some things there, but that there were still elements of the surface of the Earth that they were like, I don't know. So that's definitely an ambitious project. I think it speaks to their sense of it's practical, of course, but I also think it speaks to kind of a sense of wonder too. But
I think this is later on, but they do have, like, one of the maps.
Oh yeah.
And you have to look at it upside down
Upside
for it
down,
to
yeah.
make sense, which I thought was super duper cool. I think that's 12th century, it says, so that's another couple of chapters yet. But yeah, the maps and the coordinates for all the cities and stuff, that's very cool.
He doesn't actually explain why the maps are traditionally upside down with the north at the bottom. Does anybody know? I don't know why that is. Does anybody know why that is? Okay, everybody else is equally good, because I was like, why is that? I don't know though. So that's big science. And then we got into math. So even though Sangeeta didn't get to this part, this would be the part for her. And I honestly had a moment when I was reading these couple of chapters that I thought, oh my God, of course algebra is an Arabic word. Like, duh. Like, I don't know why to not put that together, but here we are. No problem.
I think that was the one thing that I knew going into this. That was the only thing that I had heard. And it wasn't even like I learned it that long ago. I think it was recent that I learned that.
Yeah, I will say that there were a few times, because I read this book when I was doing a lot of traveling. So my poor husband is like sitting next to me. And there were definitely a couple of times where I was like, I cannot believe I made it all this way to my education. And this is like the first I've heard of this. This is ridiculous. But I think that, oh, something very interesting has just happened. Luke has shared his screen and now fun stuff is going on. Let's see.
Sorry, I was trying to see if I could see everyone's camera, but maybe I can't. I was pressing.
Oh, are you not able to see everybody?
I just see whoever's talking.
Oh, interesting. Is that true for everybody else?
No, I can see everyone on like a little bar at the top.
Yeah, I can see
Yeah.
everyone too, yeah.
Oh. I'm gonna kill your sharing, Luke, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Yeah, that's weird. So I wonder, oh, I will have to look into that so we can see what we want to do here. Ooh, hey, there we go.
It's not a big deal.
Fancy. I don't know what's going on now. What do you guys see right now?
I've got all 4 of us on like 4 different blocks.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
There might be different options, Luke. We can kind of see what we can do about that when maybe once we get done with the video then.
Sure, yeah, no, it's no problem.
Yep. But that is kind of cool because I didn't realize you could do all that stuff. So I'm learning things. Okay, so algebra. Numbers. Yep, we got some numbers. I actually thought this, and never in a million years did I think I would be the type of person to say this, but I thought this kind of, so I'll see if I can show this. I thought this kind of, where he talks a little bit about how they denote these different things, I was like, oh, that's really neat, which is not a thing that I ever thought I would say, as mathematical notation is neat, but I liked that he kind of was walking through this gentleman must be a fantastic teacher because these are not, he's doing a really good job at keeping kind of his broad thesis really centered in your reading, but then he's introducing these really interesting ideas that had somebody told me you're going to read about algebraic notation and find it interesting, I would have said hilarious. No.
I also loved the little diagram he made.
Yeah.
With like the origin of how we do numerals.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, exactly.
The evolution of that, like that's so cool.
And then you get things like, I thought the discussion of, which I have heard a bit of this before, so this wasn't entirely new to me, but just his presentation of the idea of zero. So there's oh boy, I don't know what page it is, but there's a page where he talks a little bit about the concept of zero.
It's like a whole passage. 103?
Yep, 103. So just because I know that, Sangeeta, I don't know if you got to this part, but so he's discussing this idea of as your numerical system evolves, and I also, just as an aside, am very happy to learn that I should be calling these Hindu Arabic numerals, which I think I will pedantically do in the future, just so that I can explain to people why that's important.
You can show them that little diagram.
Yes, exactly. But he talks about the idea of, so when did people have a concept of zero? But then he also breaks it down, I think very well, into, well, what do you mean by a concept of zero? So you can have zero as a blank placeholder within a number. And so he talks about under different numbering systems, like how would you indicate 102? So are you going to do this with like groups of units? How are you going to denote that you don't have anything in the tens? So you've got one 100 unit, you don't have any 10 units, and then you've got 2 individual units. How do you denote that? So that's like a blank placeholder. But then he says, okay, well, what about zero as a philosophical concept that symbolizes nothing? And then, or is it zero as a proper number that indicates the boundary between positive and negative numbers? And he kind of then talks a little bit about different people kind of getting at different ideas of zero, which I thought was really interesting. This is why reading history is great, because it's a good reminder of just what these discoveries were. Like to understand numbers and to be able to do certain types of math, you have to be able to understand what zero is and how did that come about and what that must have been like for the first few people who figured that out, to just kind of be like, oh.
I think the fact that zero was a thing that, you know, they had to, I don't know if the right word would be invent or discover, both maybe, but I think that's a really interesting concept, because we grew up with that as a fact, right? And so having to approach that as a new concept, that would be just fascinating to see, like, to get into somebody's head of how they can actually do that. And he also makes the point of saying, like, even with the algebra that they did, they very rarely would like equal the equation to zero. So they still avoided, or I don't know if avoided, but didn't use the concept very much, I guess. But and then he also, like, eventually he gets to saying that the zero probably came from Hindus, is what he says in 505. I forget what CE stands for. Current era.
Yes, I think that's right.
It stands for common era, I think.
There it is. Yes,
Yeah.
I think that's right.
People avoid saying BC now because it's like it's not good to say BC, but it pretty much means the same thing.
Right. So, so Sangeeta, in your mathematics training, how much do they do like the philosophy of math? Do you get into discussions of zero as a concept, or does it depend on what classes you decide to take?
We are very proud of zero because it came from Indian culture. So it's definitely discussed a little bit. And I remember when I was very young, I think I was in grade 5, it was mentioned that, you know, we conceived of zero before anyone else did. But I think in general, it's not as much a big part of mathematics education as it, like, the thought behind zero and the whole thing behind zero. So yeah, it's definitely a philosophical concept, and the idea of conceiving nothingness and to have something stand for it. It is a big deal, but people don't talk about it as much.
Yeah, I wonder how much that varies across different educational systems, different regions, how much they
Did you learn about it at any point, or was it?
You know, and I'll admit that I could be that in the common refrain of the student, it's very possible that I was taught this and I don't remember. So it's like whenever you ask your students, do you guys remember doing blah, blah, blah? And they go, no. So it's very possible that I did learn. I mean, we talked about it as the numerical concept, but I don't really remember any discussion of the history of the discovery of zero, and how people would have arrived at that and what the numerical system that they would have been working with before that would have been like.
A related thing is thinking of very large numbers. I don't know if he talks about it in this book, but I read a very interesting passage that I'll share with you later. And this is also something that culture got to very well, like in pieces. And I'll share with you, it's very, very interesting to think about how big a number you can think of, even if it's not practical and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we lost you a little bit during your comments.
Yeah, my internet is not very good, but I'm just going to drop off now anyway because I have to get dinner.
Sure,
it was very nice talking to everyone.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Thanks for joining us.
Have a good discussion. Bye.
Okay, so Luke, go ahead.
There was a book I read a couple of years ago called Zero, the Biography of a Dangerous Idea.
Oh, really?
And it's essentially a whole book just on the discovery of zero and the concept of zero. It's pretty interesting. And he goes a lot into how the idea of zero was initially considered quite sacrilegious, because if God represents everything and zero is the absence of everything, then zero is against God initially, is how it was kind of perceived. So especially European European society was really apprehensive about embracing the idea of zero for that kind of reason.
Oh, that's interesting. So would you recommend this book? Do you think it's a...
I remember it got kind of boring near the end, but I thought it hooked me initially and then kind of dragged on a little bit.
Okay, so maybe worth just taking a glance at to see more about the idea of zero.
Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. So I don't want to, it's 4. I know we got started a little bit late, but I know people might have planned for 3 to 4. So he talks about numbers and algebra, and then we get into some chapters that there are discussions of individuals. And so he kind of, the way that it seems organized to me is that he picks kind of a subject and then talks about a scholar who is particularly notable from this time period in this area in that subject. So we've got philosophers. And I did some philosophy in my college training, but probably not as much as I should have. My guess is that I would hope that people who studied a lot of philosophy would know Al-Kindi, because it sounds like he was particularly important in philosophy from this region. And there's some discussion about, philosophy in particular always strikes me as an interesting subject, even if I don't read a ton of actual primary philosophy, because it always seems like a conversation between contemporary people and people who have been dead for a really long time. Because you'll get a lot of philosophers who will be like, Aristotle, what did he have to say? I'm like, he's been dead for a really long time. But it just seems like philosophy is always just, you're always in conversation with what scholars had kind of produced and left, and you're always engaging with that. So I do think that's an interesting aspect of philosophy. Did anybody want to mention anything about Al-Kindi?
So one of the things that I liked that he sort of emphasizes is that he's still a very like devout Muslim, but makes a point of saying, like, there's a quote of like how we should not be ashamed to recognize truth and assimilate it from whatever quarter it may reach us. And so, the fact that he was able to be very devout and still bring like all that philosophy of Aristotle to their time, and then be his own like prominent philosopher is super duper cool. I think. I'm sure, if you're a philosopher, he contributed a lot of important things to philosophy, but I don't know very much about the specifics of what he does. But it does mean, I'm sure that was very important at the time, actually being able to integrate philosophy from before, and because it's a different way of like thinking and talking about the world.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And so then he talks a little bit about, he picks medicine. And so he's got a chapter called The Medic, where he talks about, I'm going to try to say this right, Al-Razi, I think.
I think so.
And I like the mention of, a lot medical texts. So different notable people had written in history medical texts that still were used to train clinicians and physicians and doctors for a long time. And so I think this Al-Razi wrote his own medical text, which was circulated widely and relied on widely. And then I like, there's a bit here that talks about his approach to medicine. And he's got some translations of some of his books. So for instance, Why People Prefer Quacks and Charlatans to Skilled Physicians. Still relevant today.
Yep.
So that's, and then also, even the most skillful physicians cannot heal all diseases. So I liked these book titles because it made it clear to me that this is not only a person who's studying medicine, anatomy, and physiology as a science and disease, but also someone who's very clearly treating patients. Because some of these books are coming out of being like, why are my patients doing these ridiculous things that have nothing to do with getting better?
I really liked learning about this guy because it sounds like he did all kinds of really, really cool things. Like they talked about how many hospitals were built around that time, and how the medical people doctors. They didn't call them doctors, physicians. They had to have like this ethics. They had to like treat people regardless of their wealth or their religion. They actually had to sit an examination, which is wild for, you know, that's such a modern concept, I always thought. And he also talks about how they sort of adapted the Hippocratic Oath to an extent. And to your point of like actually writing the medical textbook, 23 volumes. That's so much.
Here's your book on the eye. Gunk. You're like, okay.
And he also specifically says that they still used it in Paris in 1395. That's so recent.
Mm-hmm.
That's so cool. The other thing that I absolutely loved about this chapter is he talks about how it's the earliest example that they can find of a clinical trial with a control group.
Oh, right, yeah.
And I'm like, real science. It's, you know, like that's, you know, the thesis of the book, right, is that they were doing things in the scientific method, and it's like, here's like such a clear example of that. It's super cool.
And I think one of the particularly interesting things about this was also, I think this guy and also, a couple of other people who I'm not going to be able to remember. So Al-Razi and other people, again, it's in the same way with philosophy, is they kind of called back to people who published before them. And so they have, you know, just trying to see if I could find this. I think he wrote something that was like doubts about, yes, the Roman physician. He's like, I don't know if all this stuff is right. And so it's interesting to kind of see them challenge kind of wisdom.
Yeah, you hear them challenging a lot of like things that had been the groundwork of medicine for the longest time. Like Galen, I think, was one of them. It's a name that I'd heard. So yeah, and so highlighting like, this are the things that they did wrong, or these are the like incorrect things. And was it Al-Razi that challenged the humors, or was that later on?
Oh boy, I don't remember, but I remember what you're talking about. I can't remember who in particular it was, because I think that might be a little bit later, because that's when it starts. They're just talking about Aristotle's philosophy, and I think Aristotle comes into it a little bit later too.
Okay.
But I definitely remember what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's so interesting that they were challenging the notion of the humors, because that was something that up until the 1700s, a lot of people were still using that as
Mm-hmm.
or possibly even later. Hopefully not too much later.
Possibly even today, there might still be people who are doing that.
But yeah.
Your point, Laura, about how the titles of those books are still relevant today, I think is something I found really interesting about this book, just in general, is how, like, depending on who was the leader at the time, science was supported, and scientists were given more resources to do their work. And then when a new leader came in and they didn't care about it, then that stuff was kind of stymied, and it really made, like, I was like, oh yeah, that's the same way it is currently too. I don't know, I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yes, the more things change.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's see. So we've got, again, we're kind of discussing our significant figures. So the next chapter is called The Physicist, and it's Ibn al-Haytham is a physicist. There's lots of delightful trigonometry. This is where we get into me going, oh yeah, trigonometry. That was a thing I did for standardized tests.
I had to read this chapter twice, because like the first time I was like, oh yes, a physicist, and I finished reading the chapter and I was like, I don't think I got any of that. I heard the word optics. And so I had to go back and be like, okay, so what are the actual like things that he did? And it was so many things. But I guess the biggest thing was, again, the scientific method, right? So it talks about like questioning previous knowledge and actually testing the knowledge that had come down. And he, you know, talks about how he like almost figured out how light, the eye perceives light, which was, again, a passage I had to read through a couple times because I was like, I don't understand. But you know, that thing and like a bunch of other things on like optics and refraction of light, and like, and you know, so I think one of the things that he emphasizes is that he didn't just sort of talk about it, but would actually try and work a lot of these things out geometrically, which is very, very cool. He talks about like, he also studied the dispersion of light into like the rainbow and all these different things. And then he also was an astronomer and wrote 25 books on astronomy and like eclipses and like planetary motion and things. He like solves this like x⁴ equation somehow. And my absolute favorite thing about, actually, I had two favorite things in this chapter. One of them was the moon illusion.
Oh yeah.
I had never heard of that.
Me neither, actually.
And when I read through it, I was like, oh yeah, the moon does look bigger when it's close to the horizon. That's so true. And then the other one was, again, sort of, you know, quoting them, talking like their scientific method, right? And I see if I can actually find the quote of like, no, this one's probably too long to read, but you know, basically saying like you have to actually like gather data. Is I guess that's the, like sort of the long and the short of this quote is like you can't just come at things with like thinking this is how it works. You have to like question your premises. You have to gather data, and I thought that was super cool. Like, what a scientist! I love it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it just certainly fits with his overall thesis about discussing kind of the origins of some of the scholarship in these different subjects by people in this region in this time. You had great notes on this chapter, so I'll just go with that. And so then we got The Prince and the Pauper, where we're talking about al-Biruni and Ibn Sina. And I tweeted the opening quote from chapter 12, so I won't read it, but the opening quote from chapter 12, I honestly think I'm going to get this framed and put it on the door of my office, because it basically talks about why you should pursue knowledge for the sake of pursuing knowledge and why that's a noble and good thing to do. And I think it's applicable for many, many, many reasons. So I might actually just put that on my door.
Yeah, just get like a little frame.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be awesome.
So, and these are two very important figures, al-Biruni and
they were contemporaries, right?
Yes, and they had a bit of a correspondence that went badly. I thought, oh, that's sad. So they exchanged letters in which they were discussing kind of, there were philosophical and scientific questions that one was posing to the other, and they just were never satisfied with the explanations. And then Ibn Sina, who was the recipient of these questions, passed off the correspondence to one of his senior students. Was like, whatevs, I'm done with you. I'm not gonna do this anymore. Which, yeah, definitely insulting. But one of the things that I wanted to, I mean, we could definitely discuss all their accomplishments, more trigonometry. But one of the things that came out of this chapter was that both of them were operating in a time of a bit more political upheaval. So they were not situated in Baghdad. They were situated in other places. And both of them, if I remember right, had to do a significant amount of moving around as a result of various antagonistic forces, different military or occupying forces or invading forces who were kind of pushing pieces across the political map. And so the both of them I think, had a bit more upheaval to their careers than the folks who were earlier in this book, kind of starting out with the House of Wisdom and sponsored by Al-Mamun. I think they had a bit more kind of peace and tranquility. So it's interesting because it's just a note to discuss how, which he talks about in the book, how the political situation, the military situation of somebody's region is definitely going to have an impact on whether or not they're even safe to be able to do scholarship, to kind of get themselves settled into a place where they have support and time and their life to be able to do the work they're doing.
Yeah, it's amazing how that can have an effect, right?
Right.
What?
Yeah. And so then he talks a bit about Andalusia. So at this point, he'd been focused on areas that we're now familiar with as being Iran, Iraq. We talked a little bit about cities that I think we might remember, unfortunately, probably from the Gulf War. But then what he does in this chapter is talk about a completely different dynasty, the Umayyad dynasty, that sponsored a similar kind of scholarship in Spain. So kind of the contributions of Islamic Spain to this movement. And part of what he notes is the importance of, because of its geographic proximity to France and England and so forth, that Spain ended up being a major conduit in the later years of this movement for this knowledge to kind of carry through into the rest of Europe and fuel the European Renaissance. So I thought this chapter was interesting because it's the bookend of this time period, and he also kind of demonstrates why that was a major reason that the European Renaissance could get access to all of this information.
And that sort of leads into the second translation movement, in which things went from Arabic to Latin, etc.
Right.
Which was also very cool. And I also love that he points out that the astronomical tables that they made in Spain were inferior to the ones that had been made in Baghdad. But those are the ones that made it into the translation. It's like,
I think that's a valuable point too, right? Because you only have access, like any historian could probably tell you that their ultimate frustration is that you only have access to what survived. Or probably anybody who studies the fossil record could tell you that frustration, that you've only got what made it. And sometimes maybe it's not actually the best thing that was available at the time, but that's what you've got. So yeah, so the inferior Toledo tables, but we made do, I guess. Okay, so I think maybe just to kind of, Lucy, you had a lot of really good notes. Am I skipping over anything that you wanted to make a note of?
I don't think so. I think we've gone through pretty much everything. I had a couple like other notes on the specifics of the Ibn Sina and al-Biruni's like contributions, but it's like all of them have so many things that they contribute that it would be a very long list. No, I think we're going through everything.
Okay.
Sorry.
So what I'd like to do, just to kind of close out, so just so I don't keep people for too long, is he has a chapter where he kind of talks about the decline of. So these two ideas are going to go together. So his penultimate chapter is an attempt to explain why this major movement of scholarship in the Islamic world eventually petered out. And he couples that with his very final chapter, which is a kind of an impassioned plea from a scientist to make an argument for why science can return to this area and why we can have scholars, a renewal of this golden age and this contribution. And so I don't know that I want to get into the reasons that he presents for the decline, but I'm more interested in a point that he made that I think I wasn't particularly aware of. So he makes the point that right now, contemporarily, there's what he calls kind of a false, maybe a false conflict in terms of people who are practicing the Muslim faith and their views on science. And so he's very careful to say that this is not, that the people of the Muslim faith are not a monolith. You have lots of variation in terms of, just like you do with, you know, people in the Christian faith, and how you can situate people on a spectrum of how much they support evolution within the Christian faith. So that's certainly true. And he is absolutely not trying to paint everyone of the Muslim faith with the same brush. But he's making an argument for kind of the birthplace of the scholarship movement to kind of return to this. So the idea that it's not in conflict with the teachings of the Quran that someone would pursue scientific knowledge, that someone would pursue truth. And so I felt like it was a very carefully written and very eloquent plea for the return of this kind of scholarship, the renewal of this kind of a golden age. It's 9 or 10 years ago now, so it'll be interesting to see how that continues. But I don't know, did you have any thoughts about that? Kind of where this now brings us to in the modern world?
I guess my thought is very similar to how I feel about, you know, scholarship here and the some of the barriers that you can encounter with it, right? Some of it is just lack of funding. Some of it is, you know, people actively thinking that it disagrees with certain religious ideologies, which I agree with him. I don't think that those two things need to conflict, but some folks do. It was a very hopeful chapter. I really liked that about it. I was a little sad to you know, learn that their current output is not what it could be, right? There's plenty of people from all over the world who have the capacity to do science, and he just showed how like beautiful the Islamic Golden Age was, and all the amazing things that came out of it. But you know, whether it's political things or, you know, political social things, there's a lot of trouble. And I don't think this is exclusive to the Muslim world, as he calls it. I think that this is probably a problem that's more pervasive throughout. And maybe that's something that science communication can help a little bit with. I did like he does mention a couple of big universities that they're trying to build, and they sound very impressive. He even says like one of them is specifically like integrated men and women, and I am like, yes,
Yeah,
big fan of that. And so yeah, you know, there's a lot of issues with how we view science even today, right? I mean, we're scientists, so we're all pro-science, but actually getting the public to be as pro-science as we are, I think, is a bigger challenge.
mm-hmm.
One that I think the whole world needs to engage in.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, Luke, did you have any thoughts about that?
Like I didn't get to that chapter, so I haven't read it. I know that there is, like, definitely, I think even outside of like religion, I think there's just typically a bit of a anti-intellectual, I don't want to say movement, but kind of sentiment in our current culture. I think people, I don't know where it comes from, if it's like kind of like not wanting to seem pretentious or what, but where people don't want to talk about some of the, like he has that chapter where he had all the scholars would come and meet and discuss those ideas. that should be something that is celebrated in society. And I'm just talking about societies in general, not necessarily the Middle East or anything. And I think typically it isn't, especially among like normal people, to like really just like talk about these deep issues. And I don't know how you change that in a society where it becomes something that's valued again, and where people are encouraged to meet up and really dive deep into these ideas. I don't know. And I like, yeah. And then in terms of the religious piece, yeah, it's such a complicated thing, because it's like, because I grew up religious and then I went into science, and I'm not religious anymore. And so for me, those two things were mutually exclusive. They didn't really jive. And so I think for a lot of people, they face the, losing something that was really part of who they are. And I think that contributes, like, so I think it like rocks like the core of a lot of people. You know what I'm trying to say?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. So anyway, and I think once you start to pull at strings, and then it just goes from there, right? And so something that you really believed in kind of starts to get eroded, which isn't, for me, it was a good thing, and I'm glad that happened. But I can understand for why a lot of people struggle with that, especially when a particular religion is also so entwined with a culture as well.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that's for not actually reading that chapter. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that that's very insightful. You haven't read the chapter, but yes, I think what you said really does mesh well with the themes of that particular chapter. And I absolutely understand what you're saying too. I do think it's tough for people who their faith is a major part of their identity, and they can defend it very vigorously when they feel that it's being challenged, which I think is true. You know, that's not anything unique to a particular faith. I think that's true for every faith. So I think to close, I'll say for my final thought, and then you guys, of course, if you'd like to share something. But I would just say that I'm really glad that I finally got a chance to read this, and I would say that I'm sincerely hopeful that I can find ways to bring the figures featured in this book into my classes. I also hope that I feel like the more exposure that people in the West get to this kind of accounting of the history and the contributions of Arabic scholars to where we are now, it can only be helpful. Because right now, I think we have a major misunderstanding between the West and the Middle East, or Christianity and Islam. And I think that this is a really fantastic example of people in this time period in this region who have contributed to where we all are today. I mean, that's the major thesis of his book, is that there's absolutely no way that we would have had the European Renaissance, and there's absolutely no way that we would be, in the West in particular, we would be where we are right now without the contributions of the people that he features in this book. And I think I was annoyed when I was reading this that this is the first I'd heard of this. So I think it would be great if we could have a better awareness of this, just because I think that it would help us to understand a little bit more what we owe to not only the Greeks, but then also these Arabic scholars who were, as he mentions, both Muslims and Jewish and Christian, but they all kind of came from this area and participated in this movement. So this was the bridge. And I think that I would really hope that as a professor myself, I can do a little bit to kind of make that more aware for people. That would be my final thought. Lucy or Luke, do you have a final thought you'd like to share?
I think jumping off of what you said. I would say that we de-emphasize the West in general in you know, how we teach history and all of those kinds of things. I think that there's, you know, rich information and knowledge to be gained from studying the Muslim world or studying the East or even the Americas. That I think our focus on what we have constructed as the West. I think it's blinded us to a lot of other really cool contributions from other places. So I think that would be, I would love to see that.
Yes, I agree. Luke, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, and I agree with what both of you said. I think there definitely needs to be less emphasis put on the West's role in science and the history of science, and more on all these other parts of the world. And I also think, and I didn't even really think about it until this book, so this is something the book highlighted for me, how much cross-pollination occurred between all these different parts of the world. So like, how much Aristotle and those philosophers influenced the Arabic scholars, and then how the Arabic scholars influenced the Renaissance, like you were saying. And so that all these different regions weren't just operating within a vacuum, they were influencing each other, which I probably should have assumed, but that never really clicked in my brain before until I read this book. I think that's an important piece of the overall history as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to thank you guys for joining me for this discussion. It's always a real pleasure to get to read this and then chat with people. As I always say, like I read books like this regardless, but it's always nice to talk to somebody about it, because otherwise I finish it and I'm like, oh. It's like there's nobody else to talk to about this. So I really do appreciate that you guys have taken the time not only to read the book, but then also to join us for the discussion. So thank you very much for that. We're going to have our third and final summer book club discussion at the beginning of September. And it is a book about Barbara McClintock. I want to say it's called The Tangled Field. I hope that's right. I should have looked that up before I said it. But it is posted. Oh, Lucy's already got it. Huzzah. Very good. So The Tangled Field, it's about Barbara McClintock, and it's by Nathaniel Comfort, which I only got from looking at Lucy's cover, so I'm not going to pretend that I knew that. So we'll be discussing that in about a month, and if you're interested in joining us for that, definitely, like Lucy did, you might be able to find it through your library, or you can get a copy of it. So for now, there you go. So for now, I will say goodbye to you guys, and thank you so much for joining me for this particular discussion.